All right, three questions will anchor my presentation this evening. What stories does one congregation tell about itself? What functions do these stories fulfill? And how do such stories and associated group activities intersect with congregational flourishing? Building on a cultural analysis, these questions help to examine a congregation's identity and sense of us as a church. To speak to these topics, I'm going to draw on a case study at a church that I'll call St. Paul's, a growing, multi-ethnic, 40-plus-year-old Catholic parish in an urban Western Canadian center. Over 4 decades, St. Paul's navigated 6 transitions that shaped the stories it tells and the culture that it seeks to build. These transitions include, first, a shared facility with a Protestant church that ended after 25 years, with the growing Catholic parish reportedly, quote unquote, overpowering the other church. Second, another shared building arrangement that resulted in an amalgamation with another Catholic parish. Third, 9 years ago, a bishop assigned a new priest to St. Paul's, who I'll call Father Bob, on the heels of an unfruitful year-long tenure with the previous priest, who himself had followed a much beloved priest beforehand of 13 years. Father Bob is dynamic and relational and has enjoyed the full support of the bishop to introduce sweeping changes at St. Paul's. Fourth, a multi-million-dollar renovation that doubled St. Paul's capacity and a fundraising campaign to reduce the church's building debt. This renovation was completed just before the pandemic. Fifth transition, the pandemic itself. And then sixth, another leadership change in the last year at the discretion of the new bishop. These transitions are the backdrop for the stories that St. Paul's tells of itself and the subculture it aims to establish. And I'm going to focus on 3 of those storylines. First, an emphasis on numerical, building space, and spiritual growth. Second, fostering a hospitable religious community. And third, collective versus priestly ownership of parish ministry. And as you hear these things, and as we move through the 3rd and 4th case studies, hopefully you'll start to hear some areas of overlap across the different case studies in different areas. And I think this is one of the things we wanted to give attention to, that yes, congregations are distinct in their own right, but there are also some commonalities within kind of the subculture of congregations as a whole. So beginning with the growth mindset. We regularly observe the link between numerical growth plus financial growth aiding spiritual growth. When Father Bob started at St. Paul's, the bishop gave him a mandate, quote, to amalgamate 2 congregations into one and build a bigger building to accommodate the whole congregation, end quote. We discovered that St. Paul's is the largest parish in Western Canada, a fact that was subsequently mentioned with pride by many. Over 4,000 attended one of 6 masses on a weekly basis before the pandemic. St. Paul's serves nearly 8,000 families within its parish boundaries. They attribute their growth to a combination of the merger with another Catholic parish that I referenced earlier, no nearby Catholic parish to compete with, and population growth in the suburbs fueled by immigration. As Father Bob told me, quote, I don't see any church being built here, so it's going to grow. This church is not going to be enough with the amount of things that the church is. The church has this potential quite a bit, end quote. The central narrative here is build it and they will come. We heard repeated refrains celebrating numerical growth, which is a reason for the needed multi-million-dollar building renovation that ought to yield even more growth. We often met ideas that the renovations are, quote, something to help us welcome more people and to leave a legacy, end quote. Still, many are concerned with the organizational strain of carrying a $12 million 35-year mortgage. One member of the Finance Council noted, quote, I don't think we have a lot of extra money for programming, end quote. The pandemic exacerbated these financial challenges. As such, there is a steady stream of appeals for donations to pay down the debt. For example, in St. Paul's welcome video, parishioners are encouraged to buy God a cup of coffee every day toward the donor wall. Isn't God worth it? End quote. In another appeal video, parishioners are told, quote, we are making progress on the 35-year mortgage, but we believe that we can do better, end quote. The goal is to pay the mortgage down in 20 years, which would save my $5 million in interest, quote, money that can be put toward ministry works, sacramental programs, and supporting the spiritual needs of our 7,600 families, end quote. Now, Father Bob is quick to note that we're not interested in numbers, we are interested in quality. What does he mean by this? He is referring to spiritual formation and growth as the aim of numerical and financial growth. The renovated building is a powerful cultural symbol that signifies, quote, a place for communing with God. As one interviewee articulated, quote, in order to grow as a parish, everything we do at St. Paul's needs to lead us back to God, end quote. We asked many at St. Paul's where they would like to see the parish in 5 years. Many spoke about continued numerical growth, reduced debt, and ongoing spiritual growth. These responses signal central elements, real and or ideal, to St. Paul's story, identity, and subculture. A second theme is hospitable community. Many we interacted with describe St. Paul's as a, quote, welcoming parish. And yet, we heard often that St. Paul's has not always been perceived this way. Several interviewees noted that during the 2 facility partnerships, there was some observed rivalry between the different churches, competition among subgroups within the same parish, and varying levels of receptivity to different priests. As Father Bob said, quote, St. Paul's didn't have a great reputation, didn't feel welcomed as a priest, because I was in the neighboring parishes too. When I used to come here, it was kind of a different attitude. I don't think many of us were interested in landing here, end quote. This is important. We talk about stories. These evolve over the course of time, and paying attention to how those evolve and why they evolve in the ways that they do. When Father Bob started at St. Paul's, one of the bishop's mandates was to amalgamate the 2 Catholic parishes into one. The following interviewee makes this observation on Father Bob's impact. Quote, there has always been a welcomeness, but it used to be a divided welcomeness. It's a very diverse community, and Father Bob's done a good job making sure it's blended. This interview provided an example of something called a cultural day. And basically it was who could cook their best food, and it was a competition. Father Bob let us know that competition language would eventually be dropped to ensure, quote, our focus is on the Lord and let's keep it there, end quote. Today, hospitable community, family, and home are descriptors that parishioners use to characterize St. Paul's. For example, one interviewee said, I've been involved in many parishes, and one of the things I say about St. Paul's is it has a very welcoming spirit, end quote. The growth narrative at St. Paul's has some unintended consequences for a hospitable community. Sociologists have long recognized that as church size grows, people's level of connection to and investment in fellow group members tends to diminish. It is more difficult to know others or to ensure group conformity. This reality is magnified in Catholic versus Protestant contexts, where there are fewer parishes and priests relative to Catholic affiliates. One way we witnessed this tension was during rites of passage rituals. When attending services over multiple weekends, we were struck by how impersonal, almost factory-like, the sacrament of reconciliation or First Communion could be experienced for those families involved. We observed many families stand when called upon. Priests read scripts without looking up and out to those that they were actually speaking to, and visiting priests to the parish declaring, we as a parish are praying for you. There was also one occasion where a priest invited all families present for First Communion to stand and then proceeded to read the scripted material, only that there were no families actually present to stand for said ritual. So these are the kinds of things that we give attention to. These observations remind us that congregations can tell stories or build a subculture around areas that sometimes add organizational strain to other areas. And third, collective ownership. Reinforcing a hospitable community ethos, one of Father Bob's core tenets is that, quote, the parish does not belong to the priests, it belongs to the parishioners. He put this cultural value into practice shortly after arriving at St. Paul's. He disbanded and then reestablished the various leadership councils, including members from both Catholic parishes that amalgamated. One longtime member recalls the goal to, quote, bring them back to St. Paul's and make them feel welcome, get them participating on committees and feeling a part of it. It was important we welcomed them and found a way they could come into the community, end quote. Many at St. Paul's also spoke favorably on the emphasis on including, collaborating with, and empowering others in leadership. We heard several stories involving parishioners being involved and invited into leadership, or where congregants had ideas for new ministry initiatives, and Father Bob or other leaders encouraged them to go for it. This is partially reflected in St. Paul's strong subculture of volunteerism, for instance, where over 1,000 volunteer there. As our data collection continued, it became clear that Father Bob was instrumental to St. Paul's flourishing. One parishioner noted they were, quote, grateful for the stability of the parish over the last few years. No movement of priests has been positive for that stability, end quote. Yet as another told us, quote, we all know priests are only expected to be here 3 to 5 years. That's the norm, end quote. With no foreknowledge of his pending transition, we probed the anticipated impact should Father Bob transition from St. Paul's. One response, typical of others, suggested, quote, I don't think it's going to make a huge impact because of everything that he's putting in place, end quote. By this, she meant intentional efforts to include many people in the shared ministry of the parish. This statement also refers to statements and systems and structures that Father Bob instituted, reflective of a third mandate given to him from the bishop at his appointment, quote, to put protocols in place because people did their own stuff, end quote. And this is where we learned of the binder. This is our very first meeting on site there, that stored parish policies and procedures. For example, the binder is integral to volunteer activities. We heard from one person, quote, when you have procedures in place, people know what their expectations are. With all our volunteers, there's training manuals, there's position descriptions, there's charts for different ministries. Everybody is given what the expectations are for whatever they're doing. I think when you let people know what you expect of them, then people don't want to disappoint, end quote. When asked what impact he thinks his eventual departure would have on St. Paul's, Father Bob says the following, quote, the moment I go, I want to be forgotten, and I mean it. It's not about me. When I'm gone, I want the parish to function seamlessly. That's the greatest gift they could give me. If they could just function on their own and smooth, I don't want them to miss me in a way like, now what? What do we do? We build the parish. We built the building. We are the church, end quote. Research indicates the potential impact of leadership change in Catholic parishes might be lower than in other religious contexts because of the emphasis on tradition, structure, liturgy, and a shared Catholic subculture rather than the individual persona of a single leader. I want to conclude with 5 observations. First, the stories congregations tell can speak both to reality and aspiration. As Galen Watts expresses in his recent book, The Spiritual Turn, quote, telling one's story is not merely descriptive, but also prescriptive, end quote. Thus, stories partially function to direct a congregation to embody an ideal identity they wish to live into. Second, congregational stories reflect a confluence of institutional and contextual factors. These include individual, leader, organizational, and denominational histories, perceptions, and experiences, alongside societal and demographic changes beyond the congregation. Together, these factors contributed to a distinctive St. Paul subculture that evolved as the parish and its social environment changed, while also laying tracks for a common congregational subculture that transcends change. As James Hopewell says in his book, Congregation Stories and Structures, narrative functions for people to give sense and order to their lives. He goes on to state that the experience of the lived present must have a narrative character because it necessarily ties the perception of the moment to the memory of past events and to the anticipation of the future, end quote. Third, well-intentioned narratives and steps toward congregational flourishing can simultaneously introduce or amplify organizational strain in other areas. We saw this with some of the financial pressures plus less personal elements in the face of a growing St. Paul's parish. Fourth, part of what binds St. Paul's storylines together and possibly helps us to explain areas of flourishing at St. Paul's is collective ownership. This approach invites people into a shared story, equips and empowers many to contribute to the evolving story and to own the parish's story for themselves. This quest is aided when one experiences a hospitable community, with the likely byproduct of numerical, financial, and spiritual growth at the parish. The renovated building represents a foundational symbol of these identity markers at St. Paul's. And fifth, the stories and associated functions and flourishing to arise at St. Paul's were unlikely to occur without Father Bob's leadership. This includes the combination of first, the bishop's threefold mandate for Father Bob to establish systems and structures, amalgamate 2 parishes, and build a larger facility. Second, the bishop's unwavering support for Father Bob to do some of this difficult work. And then finally, Father Bob's priestly authoritative presence that combined a warm and personable demeanor with a clear set of convictions on how things should be done at the parish. I close with the following statement made by a parishioner when asked to summarize what is working at St. Paul's to help it to flourish. And the statement I'm about to read was met by applause by the 50+ people who had gathered for this particular event. Quote, "We are a diverse and welcoming, sacramental, multicultural Catholic community focused on learning and formation, evangelization, and volunteering, with great leadership, meeting in a wonderful building, and worshiping all for the glory of God." Thank you very much.